Hello, everyone. I'm Merve Tahiroğlu, the POMED's Turkey Program Coordinator, and I'd like to welcome everyone to our panel today, Turkey's Intensifying Crackdown, What It Means and What's at Stake. Democracy and human rights in Turkey have suffered some major setbacks recently. Just last month, Turkey unjustly jailed another prominent opposition lawmaker, Ömer Faruk Gergerlioğlu, while the government began seeking the closure of Turkey's second largest opposition party in parliament, HDP. Meanwhile, President Erdoğan also unilaterally withdrew Turkey from the Istanbul Convention, which is a major international treaty designed to combat violence against women. And these moves followed a terrible winter of police crackdowns on student protesters at Istanbul's prestigious Boğaziçi University, and also shameful instances of homophobic hate speech by top Turkish officials online on social media. So I'm here with three outstanding panelists to discuss what these and other developments mean for Turkey's human rights situation, its democracy, politics, and of course, relations with the US and Europe. To introduce our panelists, Emma Sinclair Webb is the Turkey Director of Human Rights Watch, which really does amazing work on and in Turkey. Gönül Tol is the Turkey Program Director of the Middle East Institute, one of the best Turkey experts that we have here in Washington. And Amberin Zaman is an exceptional Turkish journalist and a senior correspondent for the Middle East and North Africa at Al Monitor. Thank you all for being here today. I'm really looking forward to hearing your insights. So I will ask two rounds of questions to our panelists, and then we'll take a few audience questions. You may submit a question at any time through the Zoom's Q&A button down below, or you could email us at communications@pomed.org. We will wrap up the discussion in about an hour. So with that, I will start. Emma, I'd like to start with you because the Human Rights Watch issued a very strong statement recently, which said, and I want to quote it, that President Erdoğan is, quote, dismantling human rights protections and democratic norms on a scale unprecedented in the 18 years he has been in office. Would you start us off by walking us through what this dismantling means for democratic governance and human rights in Turkey? And would you explain to us why, because we've seen so many waves of repression in recent years in Turkey, what makes the scale of this dismantling now unprecedented, as the Human Rights Watch statement said?
Thank you very much, Merve. It's a great pleasure to be here and with Gönül and Amberin to discuss these issues. I think it was a difficult decision for us to say unprecedented, because you're right. I mean, so much has happened in the last few years that it's all unprecedented, right? I mean, ever since particularly the failed coup attempt, we've seen wave upon wave of measures that are about hollowing out democracy and targeting critics in Turkey. And you could say, actually, that the establishment of the presidential system itself was the unprecedented change. I mean, I think that there would be an argument for saying that. And at the time that happened, we made a lot of, we did Q&As on that, and we focused on that quite a bit, but it's quite abstract for most people, that. We focused particularly on the control of the judiciary and the appointment of judges and control of the establishment of the judiciary, so allowing the executive to really assert enormous authority over the Council of Judges and Prosecutors. But as time went on, what we mainly saw in the past few years was, of course, under emergency rule, we saw people dismissed. We saw unprecedented measures taken under emergency rule. And then when emergency rule, state of emergency was lifted back in 2018, we saw some of the measures made permanent. But I think what's characterized what we've seen over the past few years particularly is the focus on the crackdown on critics through criminal justice, through the criminal justice system. So it's the targeting of people through arbitrary detention, especially, that has really made the headlines. And this is what, you know, whether it's journalists, rights defenders, politicians, different professional groups like lawyers, This has been the feature we've seen very often. But I think the point we've reached now has gone beyond that. It's not just misuse of the criminal justice system. It's to sort of punish critics and silence them. It's really a further hollowing out and takeover process by the Erdogan government. And the hollowing out of democratic institutions and checks and balances we've really seen actually under the pandemic, the COVID pandemic happening very much with the change, very quick rushed legislation, change to the law on bar associations, which, you know, is an attempt really to prevent a very credible voice from speaking out by creating alternative bar associations in big cities, further internet censorship. And then coming into this year, and this is the unprecedented part, the kind of reach into higher education that we're now seeing. We need to dominate higher education, says the Erdogan government. And that's what they've done with the Boğaziçi affair and all its dimensions, which go on and on, by the way. We've seen within Boğaziçi University lots of steps to reduce the authority of faculties and academics. And only today I'm hearing more news about how that is actually happening inside the institution. So the long reach of the Erdogan regime is to go take over the higher education and also to revert to tactics against opposition parties, which we haven't seen for a long time. And the closure trial came, we know the closure case came in answer to Devlet Bahçeli's request for such a thing to happen. And at the moment it's been put on hold, it's been thrown back, the indictment against the People's Democratic Party. But it's coming again next week with a trial against all the leading figures in the party, which is an appalling trial coming up, charges them with stuff, tweets from 6 years ago, 7 years ago. And we really feel that when you put all these things together this year, you've got this sort of wave after wave of actions, and obviously culminating also in the striking at the Council of Europe with the withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention, a very harmless convention. You know, you wouldn't have thought you could make so much political mileage out of such a convention. But it's not only Turkey doing that, of course, it's Poland and Hungary and other places too. And I think that bold withdrawal, I hadn't seen that coming, actually. I have to say, I was surprised by it. And I really think it's a very pragmatic step to mop up, you know, the remains of Islamist opposition who are not fully contained within AK Party. So very much outreach to Saadet Party and others. And it seems to me, in that sense, it's, you know, there's a principled aspect of it, which is against women's rights, but it's also a political maneuver, really, as well. Now, I know we're constrained for time, so I don't want to give you the full laundry list of all that's been done. But I think that's why, you know, these two big issues, particularly about the convention and the attitude to international law that we've seen stated very brazenly this year. We've seen Erdogan repeatedly argue that the European Court is not binding. The decisions of the European Court are not binding on Turkey. Now, we haven't seen arguments like that before. So it's a very provocative, these are provocative gestures towards the Council of Europe. Obviously, this story with the EU goes back further. It's already a stalemate there. But it's interesting how the targeting of the Council of Europe has come up very much in the last couple of months, few months. So that's what I would say in answer to that question. I mean, I could go on and I could give you a whole more list, but I think that's why we decided that this is the real dismantling is happening in this year, and it builds on previous.
That was, I think, a great answer, and we can delve into some of the issues more specifically later. But I do, thanks for explaining why just in the past few months there have been this sort of escalation, even though these moves and these crackdowns have been ongoing for a few years now. So thanks for setting the scene for that. And I want to turn to Gönül next for the reasons why we're seeing this escalation, as Emma explained, just in the pandemic over the last year, and she called it, it's a little bit political maneuvering. And a lot of people seem to be thinking it's because of the upcoming elections in 2 years, and see this as an election strategy for Erdogan. So if that is the case, then what is Erdogan's political strategy here, or his end game, I would like to ask you, and how is the opposition parties and the opposition bloc responding to this political strategy?
Oh, thank you, Marve. Thanks for the very kind words in the introduction. I think Erdogan is intensifying crackdowns because the opposition is mounting a much more effective challenge, and Erdogan is losing ground in the polls. According to the most recent ones that I've seen, he's still the most popular leader, but he's losing support, and even his personal popularity has taken a hit in the last few months, and opposition figures' popularity are rising. So in the past, when his existing alliances did not get him what he wanted, Erdogan would either replace them with others or expand his coalition by bringing in new ones. But at this point, he cannot do either of these things. He's stuck with the nationalists, and he cannot turn to others. Look at the main opposition blocs. You have the main opposition, the CHP, you have the Nationalist E-Party, and then you have the Kurds. And none of those parties, these major blocs, are willing to join forces with Erdogan. So Erdogan cannot comfortably expand his base. So he is trying to shrink the oppositions by dividing the opposition. So he crafted a new strategy based on sowing discord among the opposition and constraining a political space. So how is he doing that? Well, the Kurdish question is the opposition coalition's soft underbelly, because Turkish nationalism is very strong among opposition ranks. So Erdogan is hoping to drive a wedge between opposition parties and the pro-Kurdish party by criminalizing the HDP. And it worked until it didn't. Just recently, instead of getting behind Erdogan, something that they always did in the past on the Kurdish question, the opposition acted like an opposition and criticized Erdogan, not the HDP. When Turkish military launched a failed operation to save 13 people abducted by the PKK, Erdogan attacked the HDP, and he sought the opposition's support to divert attention away from the operation's failure. But this time, opposition parties criticized Erdogan for not doing more to save those people. So I would say the Kurdish question is still a sensitive matter for the opposition, but I feel like the opposition turned a corner and will be more vigilant about Erdogan's use of Kurds to weaken the opposition. So I think the opposition parties are doing a much better job, and Erdogan is on the defensive. Another recent striking example, the opposition launched a campaign alleging misuse of central bank reserves to protect Turkish currency, a decision by Erdogan's son-in-law when he was presiding over the economy. So the opposition put posters on billboards, hang them outside CHP buildings, asking, where's the $120 billion? Which refers to the dollars sold by Turkey's state banks to support Turkish lira. So police ripped them down. And Erdogan, as well as other AKP officials, were forced to respond to those allegations, which is not very common. And yesterday, after the CHP revealed that the trade ministry bought supplies from the trade minister's own company, Erdogan was forced to remove her. So I think these are all signs that Erdogan feels electorally vulnerable, and the opposition is doing a much better job. But the flip side of that is that now that the opposition is mounting a more effective challenge to Erdogan, Erdogan is trying to shrink the space for legitimate opposition. So that is the second leg of his strategy. He is doing that by using court cases against the opposition leaders and members. He's now, for instance, trying to strip Kılıçdaroğlu's parliamentary immunity, among others. And efforts to close down the HDP is part of the same strategy. So I think increasing crackdowns is a sign that Erdogan is not confident about his electoral fortunes.
That was a really great explanation of this. Thank you. So the more defensive he's feeling, the more he's likely to keep cracking down and escalating his crackdowns on the opposition and civil society. Amber, with that, I want to turn to you and first ask you if you agree with this political strategy assessment that Gunnar explained to us, but also, is it all an election ploy? I mean, what is Erdogan trying to achieve with these disparate seeming moves that all seem to come together coherently in the way he's ruling the country right now? What is he trying to achieve with things like taking over Boğaziçi University or shutting down an opposition party, etc.?
Well, thank you too for the very kind introduction, Merve, and I obviously agree with everything that both Gunnar and Emma said, and so they were so very articulate and comprehensive in their responses, so very hard to say very much more than that. But when we pose the question, what's Erdogan's, strategy? His strategy from the get-go has always been to remain in power and to retain absolute power, and he's been extremely methodical about it, and I would say extremely successful. And so when we look at those poll numbers that Gunnar cited, yes, the opposition has shown itself to be more cohesive and willing to work together. And we saw the most sort of substantive articulation of that during the 2019 municipal elections, where they formed this bloc and managed to unseat all those AKP mayors in those very critical cities, Istanbul, Ankara, etc. But, given just how adverse the circumstances are currently in Turkey with COVID, with this declining economy, with this, absolute meltdown in the rule of law, and, there's this very unkind government that's in power, you would think that those polls would show, the opposition making a huge leap. Well, it hasn't. I mean, there's still, certainly when you look at Erdogan's own personal popularity, he still seems, fairly popular for somebody who's been in power for nearly 2 decades now, and with everything that's happened over those 2 decades. And when you look at the individual parties, the needle doesn't seem to be moving very much at all. Certainly not when you look at the newly formed parties, the ones that broke away from the AK Party, Gelecek, the future party, Ali Babacan. You would expect them to sort of, be making more significant progress, and yet they're not. Of course, one can question to the extent to which people are honest when they're doing these polls, responding, etc. What we see really, where we really see the leap, is in the undecided voters. And so the battle will be over those undecided voters. And I think that, given that every single day Erdogan is actually cheating, it doesn't happen just at the elections. It happens by virtue of the way, he manipulates, controls the media, the suppression of free expression, the all-out assault on civil society, on everything. It's a whole chain, and it's very systematic, as I said. Lawyers are under assault. Women's organizations, who are among the most effective, especially among the Kurdish women, they're under assault. Lawyers, the bars, everything is under assault. So very systematic, and the lesson that Erdogan will have taken away from 2019 is precisely that he should never allow any such, failure, defeat to occur again. And at the same time, of course, you can't sort of talk about any of this without looking around outside, beyond Turkey, and the fact that, by and large, the European Union, for certain, is allowed to accommodate this behavior of Turkey, that he manages to, sort of, this brinksmanship certainly seems to work in his favor so far. Okay, the relationship with the United States has really deteriorated, but even so, he still seems to be managing. So just a few points. When we were talking about the Istanbul Convention, I think we also need to add that it's also very much an anti-homophobic, however much the broader strategy, as Gönül and Emma laid it out, is to sort of pull in these conservative Islamist votes and consolidate on that front to sort of broaden his base the maximum possible, so that when, he obviously wants to retain this veneer of legitimacy, so the more votes, the better. But this anti-homophobic element, I think, we must not ignore. It's very much present, and it was in the Boğaziçi protests as well. When the students raised the flag, the rainbow flag, and juxtaposed it with the poster of Mecca, whatever that was, used a lot against to justify the crackdown. And the second thing that I must mention that I found extremely alarming, that when Erdoğan at a recent meeting, public event, was asked about this convention, he said, well, Islamic law, Islam prohibits violence against women. That's as if to say, we don't need laws, we don't need secular laws to defend women against violence. The Quran is enough. I found that extremely alarming, and the way he said it so dismissively, and said, well, okay, but if you insist, we can come up with an Ankara Convention. So I find that very alarming, the fact that, that he can say that he can articulate that Islam in and of itself should be enough protection.
Gönül, please.
I just wanted to add something to what Amber'in just said about the Istanbul Convention. I think both the decision to withdraw from the convention, as well as turning Hagia Sophia into a mosque, were decisions taken to bolster Erdogan's conservative Muslim credentials. So it's more, it's an effort beyond capturing the votes of Islamist parties, conservative parties, but it's about legitimacy. Because I think that those credentials, his Muslim conservative credentials, have taken a hit due to corruption and nepotism, the lavish lifestyle that Erdogan and AKP officials and some of party supporters live at a time when young people with 3 university degrees are selling fruits on the street. So Erdogan cannot solve people's real problems, so he resorts to such symbolic acts to bolster his legitimacy.
That's a very important point. Thank you so much for bringing it in. And I think, the way Amber'in explained, the Ankara Convention as opposed to Istanbul Convention also, of course, has major connotations regarding how Turkey sees its international role and becoming increasingly nativist as opposed to more of an international participating, open society and open country. So it's really alarming for him to say, we're moving from the Istanbul Convention to an Ankara Convention. I think Hungary is saying similar things in Poland as well.
May I just add one thing about, the point about all of this being unprecedented. Nicholas Danforth, who's my favorite male Turkey analyst, said that Erdogan is Turkey's first elected autocrat. And as such, these really truly are uncharted waters.
That you mean that people are still voting for him and electing him?
Well, that we can't really foresee what comes next so easily, because it's a whole new ball game with this elected autocrat.
Yeah, this is that's a very good point. It is uncharted territory, but this actually is a great segue into my next question, turning back to Emma, because there are certain things that we can do, particularly the international community. Amber'in mentioned that the Europeans have sort of allowed Erdogan to pursue these crackdowns without much consequences, but there are also institutions that Turkey, particularly European institutions that Turkey is part of, a major one being the Council of Europe and the European Court of Human Rights, whose decisions Turkey is bound to follow. And I know that the Human Rights Watch deals with these institutions and mechanisms. So Emma, I wanted to ask you, what are these international mechanisms and institutions that can help stop the deterioration of human rights in Turkey? How effective are they? And if they're not effective, why do you think that is?
Well, that's a really good question, and it's one we're often asked, given what's already been pointed out, Amber'in pointed out, is, the failure of the EU to be able to respond robustly, and the kind of game of brinkmanship where everything is a win-win for Erdogan, it's very difficult to get international institutions, intergovernmental bodies to respond in kind. They will not take this very pro-conflict approach that Erdogan favors. In fact, they shy away from it. And what we see at the moment, especially in the EU, is that the German government has decided to take an entirely transactional approach with Turkey and really just say, you know, politically, we're not on the same page. Therefore, we just have to make the best of what we got. And we know it's, you know, agreement over calming the waters in the East Mediterranean, refugee policy, migration issue. These things become a priority. And it makes the EU look extremely weak because Erdogan seems to be able to start fires, and simply by slightly dampening the fires, walking back from them, that looks like progress for the EU. And then the EU starts to use a language of positive agenda. One of the most unfortunate, tone-deaf sounding expressions for people living in Turkey, who, you know, I mean, not supporters of Erdogan, but the positive agenda. What positive agenda? Yes, things, the Oruç Reis boat has backed off for a while. So that's part of the positive agenda. So we get, it is very difficult, I think. It's a sort of existential crisis of the EU that we're seeing too, is that how do they use their leverage at all? Do they have any leverage? And they're also very afraid. What we notice all the time, I think, in our meetings with EU member states is they say, well, yes, we can threaten that and we can threaten that, but what if it doesn't work? They're very worried about going there. They're worried about the prospect of their own failure in securing anything. And this was pointed out to me by somebody working actually in an embassy the other day. Says, this is not my idea. I thought it was quite a striking point that the fear of your own failure, it sort of holds you back. And I thought that was a really good way of putting it. Now that's the EU, but let's move to the Council of Europe. Council of Europe, Turkey courts the Council of Europe much more. Turkey is one of the only countries that has direct flights to Strasbourg. Which is pretty extraordinary. Strasbourg's a difficult place to get to. And not many countries have direct flights there. So Turkish Airlines goes there, you know, several times a week or even every day. And, you know, one thing you notice when you go to Strasbourg and you go into the European Parliament and Europe Council of Europe buildings is that lots of Turkish delegations are present all the time. They do spend a lot of effort in being there and having trainings and exchanges, and it's quite phenomenal, actually. What we see, though, is, you know, obviously there's the withdrawal from the convention. The other issue is the European Court of Human Rights, and we've tried to put quite a lot of focus onto symbolic, emblematic, big court decisions. And those two big decisions, the emblematic ones, are the Kavala decision, the decision about Osman Kavala, and the decision about Selahattin Demirtas. And each decision contains within it, you know, encyclopedia of things that Turkey needs to do to change its laws and practices. They don't only relate to Osman Kavala and Selahattin Demirtas. And that's why those decisions are very well worth engaging with. And at the Committee of Ministers level, Committee of Ministers being the foreign ministers of the Council of Europe member states, Committee of Ministers have to oversee the implementation of these decisions, these judgments. And that's a very thorny process. It takes long, it takes years. In the case of Azerbaijan, we once saw that really it was infringement procedures against Azerbaijan that got Azerbaijan to reverse certain bad things it was doing and release people from detention. Now, obviously, we're hoping that this could be the same in the case of Turkey. Infringement procedures against Turkey over non-release of Osman Kavala and non-release of Selahattin Demirtas. Could it turn into, you know, further pressure from the Council of Europe, the Committee of Ministers, on Turkey to implement. Now, I think it is worth pursuing this. We can say that Turkey is constantly, cocking a snoot at the Council of Europe and at the court and saying we won't implement the decision, they're not binding. We see all those arguments, but we do also see in Turkey this sort of schizophrenic reaction to the court, which is, you can claim politically that these are not binding decisions, but they write endless reams of explanation to the Committee of Ministers. Now that is in contrast with a country like Russia. Russia doesn't write long explanations to the Committee of Ministers. Russia doesn't care. It writes a page and a half about Navalny, saying Russian courts are supreme. And basically the European court is nothing. Turkey doesn't do that. It does jump through all these sort of hoops of trying to show it's doing something to the Council of Europe. I still think that's a good thing, and it's something we should work with. The present, isn't forever. There is a future. It's very important to press on these points for a future that may come. And for that reason, we do think it's really worth engaging with the European Court decisions and trying to say to EU governments and Council of Europe member state governments that, look, yes, we know there are lots of issues on the table with Turkey. There's lots of foreign policy issues. There's the East Mediterranean. There's Black Sea, there's Montreux, there's this, there's that, the other. I mean, active role in conflicts, Libya, Syria, Armenia, Azerbaijan. All of these things are on the table for the international community as it relates to Turkey. But what we're trying to say to the international community is ring fence these decisions of the European Court and insist on them. Say these are legally binding decisions. We will talk till the cows come home about your foreign policy and how to calm down the situation in the East Mediterranean. But we insist on keeping this issue about the European Court separate, and we will enforce it. And I think we need much stronger voices on that. And that's what we're trying to propose all the time. Of course, this is it's incremental gain over a very long time. And it's very demoralizing at the moment, of course, a lot of the time.
Yeah, but you made a very important point, I think, which is that even when Turkey defies these institutions, it still feels that it's some sort of attachment and the need to explain why it's defying them, and that it's not like Russia, and there's still some attachment there, and it can be a point of pressure. Gunnar, will you bring us back to Washington and the relations with the US? Because with the Biden administration, we have a new administration that self-declares that it puts human rights at the center of US foreign policy, and we've somewhat seen that with Turkey so far. But how do you assess the Biden administration's Turkey policy so far, and how Turkey's human rights situation is factoring into that relationship?
Well, before answering that question, Merve, let me second what Emma just said about EU's positive agenda. I completely agree with her, and I feel strongly and quite frustrated. An EU positive agenda that ignores human rights isn't positive at all. When it defies EU values, when it fails Turkey's citizens, some of whom still have faith in the EU and the liberal democratic values that it represents. So ignoring human rights also overlooks the close relationship between Turkey's authoritarian turn and its aggressive and militaristic foreign policy. So it's no coincidence that Turkey became a problematic partner for the West starting from 2011. That was when Erdogan consolidated his power. And in terms of Biden administration's track record on human rights, I would wait for April 24th to see whether the administration is willing to match words with action. Biden had promised on the campaign trail to recognize the Armenian genocide, but as Emma mentioned, there are several areas where Turkish and US national security interests overlap. and where US seeks Turkish support. Afghanistan is one of them, the Black Sea, the Iran nuclear file are some of those areas. So despite his campaign pledge, Biden might not want to strain ties further by recognizing the genocide to keep Erdoğan on board in these areas. I think the chances of him recognizing it are greater, but if he doesn't, he will be strengthening the message that he has already sent to human rights abusers across the world when he gave the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman a free pass. And that message was, I will talk tough, but at the end of the day, pragmatic considerations will prevail. So that's not a message that this administration, who prides on making human rights a central pillar of its foreign policy making, that's not the right message. So, but there is a dramatic change of tone, obviously, in the administration's way of dealing with human rights. That's a fact, but it's just that so far narrative. And don't get me wrong, I think it is important to publicly name and shame those countries that commit human rights abuses, but you should also be willing to do more to signal that it's not just tough talk. Europeans, being Turkey's largest trading partner, have more leverage over Erdoğan, especially now when Turkish economy is in bad shape. So coordinating policy with Europeans is the key. Offering bigger carrots and bigger sticks, could use investment or economic aid, or tie updating customs union to specific asks on human rights, or ask German Chancellor Merkel to see how she secured the release of Deniz Yücel, the Turkish-German journalist. Turkey relies on access to foreign funds to finance its account deficit, and German banks play a big role in that process. They're one of the top providers of lending to Turkish private sector. So when Merkel secured the release of Deniz Yücel, for instance, at Germany's urging, the European Investment Bank put its Turkey projects on hold. Right, and Merkel said that she would seek to curtail the European Union's pre-accession funding for Turkey, and threaten. So the key here is for the Biden administration to coordinate policy with the Europeans. But of course, as Emma said, the problem is that the Europeans themselves are not willing to use. They don't basically punish Erdoğan for his bad behavior. They think that they've been refraining from more forceful action to punish Erdoğan, thinking that look what he's doing in the Eastern Mediterranean. He's being great. He just withdrew the ship. So they are basically refraining from criticizing him on the foreign policy front, but that's really bolstering him. That's really strengthening what he's been doing on the domestic front, and that's not a good strategy.
That is a grim picture, listening to the two of you talk about the international dimension of things. Amberin, I'll turn it to you. Please do weigh in on both of these questions that I asked. I'm sure you have your own insights and analyses of these things, but I also want to, before bringing it up to the audience questions, which I'm seeing that are coming in, thank you all, also want to bring it back to the domestic situation and the social impact of the deterioration of the human rights, particularly with the crackdowns on Kurdish politicians and the HDP. I would like to get your thoughts on how you think the Kurdish society in particular, and what these crackdowns would mean in the long term for Turkish-Kurdish relations and Turkish democratic governance in Turkey moving forward.
Well, the answer is a very short one, nothing good, obviously. But it is, again, a whole new level of repression that we're currently witnessing, particularly since the collapse of the peace process in 2015. And of course, I mean, with the failed coup, things of course reached a whole new level. And I'm sure most of the people who are following this, the panel, are aware of, you know, many of the things that have happened. For instance, around 95 democratically elected Kurdish mayors stripped of their seats and replaced with so-called administrators, trustees, so the will of the people thrown in the dustbin. And it's not just the mayors who are being stripped, you're also having a municipal council members elected from the HDP also being stripped of their seats. So it's, you know, it goes deeper. At the same time, you have, I mean, these figures are from the HDP, but some 20,000 HDP members or activists arrested since the coup, and some 10,000 of them remain in jail. And I mean, on the most ridiculous charges. And of course, these include former members of parliament, most notably the former HDP chair, Selahattin Demirtas, and Figen Yüksekdağ, is that her name? Yüksekdağ. And the charges are all basically manufactured to keep these people in jail. So you can have somebody being sent to jail just for reading out a statement, for example. That's immediately construed to be a terrorist act to prove that you're a member of the PKK. But to me, the really new and more alarming aspect, or equally alarming, shall I say, aspect of this repression of the Kurds is the fact that it's now spilled well beyond Turkey's own borders. Yes, you know, we've always had the Turkish military operating inside Iraqi Kurdistan as well, carrying out, you know, massive military operations there. And then Gönül just mentioned the Gari operation, failed operation to rescue the 13 hostages, which resulted in all of their deaths. But the fact that also today in Syria, that Turkey has carried out these large-scale military offensives inside northern Syria, where they've occupied Afrin, which is a mainly Kurdish enclave, and more recently Tel Abyad and Serikanye, which are mixed, ethnically mixed Arab Kurdish areas. And the human rights situation there is just horrible, and this has been documented by Human Rights Watch, by the United Nations. You have, I mean, wide-scale abuses, abductions. In Afrin alone, 150 women are missing. You have rape, you have theft of property, extortion rackets that are being run by these Turkish-supported Syrian Sunni Arab opposition groups. And you basically have what international lawyers would call war crimes being committed there. Arbitrary executions. You have the execution of Hevrin Khalaf, this Syrian Kurdish politician, back in 2019, October, when Turkey launched its Operation Peace Spring. And you also have large numbers of Kurdish people, Syrian citizens, inhabiting the spaces occupied by Turkey, being illegally rendered to Turkey, where they're prosecuted, put in jail on the most specious charges. For instance, let's say you were somebody who worked in a municipality that was run by the PYD inside the areas that are currently occupied by Turkey. That's construed as being proof that you're part of a terrorist organization. Things like this happening, very alarming. Then there's something else that also needs to be mentioned here. The fact that not only are people, you know, living beings being disrespected, abused, but the dead are today being abused in Turkey. During the peace process, families began burying their children, their loved ones, building cemeteries inside Turkey, laying their children to rest. And this gave them a sense of peace, you know, especially against the backdrop of this peace process. People sort of, you know, felt that there was hope and a way of sort of, you know, healing. And being able to establish these cemeteries was part of that. After the peace process collapsed, the Turkish government began destroying these cemeteries. In one case, bombing one from the air. In the case of one cemetery near Bitlis, nearly 200 graves were dug up. The remains of the people there, buried there, were put in plastic boxes, little Tupperware, and transported to a pauper's grave near the Black Sea. People who lose children in the ongoing war between the Turkish state and the PKK are not allowed to hold, you know, dignified burials for their children, to mourn them. This is a whole new level of abuse that needs to be articulated for the world to know. The sort of lack of respect, really. And I mean, all of this to say that, you know, the anger, the alienation felt by the Kurds is growing by the day. You know, if this is what you think is the solution to your Kurdish problem, well, you're just making it so much more worse by, you know, criminalizing their movement, putting their elected members in jail, and not even allowing them any sense of dignity in death.
Thanks for painting that graphic picture in our minds. I think it really puts everything in context and proportion. One of the first audience questions that I want to take, which is a sort of a follow-up that Amber and I want to ask you per what you were just talking about. It's a speculative question, but in light of this picture that you just painted for us with the Kurds in Turkey, how do you see, in case, you know, both given what is happening right now, but also if there is an actual formal ban on the HDP, where do you see these 6 million voters doing? What do you see them doing in the next election? Do you think they will participate? Do you think Erdogan's plan is to allow these votes to remain consolidated somehow or disperse? Or do you think people will sit out the next election and no longer participate politically? It's a bit speculative, but I think it would be.
Well, I mean, this debate is going on within the HDP. You know, should we be Erdogan enablers by participating in this theater that's presented to the world as a democracy, or should we just, you know, walk away? And I think somebody like Gergerlioğlu, who the HDP member of parliament was stripped of his seat and sent to jail most recently, someone like him would argue that, you know, at least when we're in parliament, we can still ask these questions, these uncomfortable questions. We can still, you know, we still have a platform. So, you know, why should we deny ourselves that? But others would say, no, you know, it's just legitimizing the regime. I mean, I don't have the answer and it will play out. But I think what's important to note here is, you know, we cannot have these conversations as if, you know, politics are, you know, taking place normally in Turkey. That they're not, you know, this is a very skewed system, skewed entirely in favor of the regime. And while people are very buoyed and encouraged by what happened during the municipal elections, you know, voter suppression during the parliamentary elections has been much more easy for the government, particularly in rural areas, certainly in the southeast. And we saw that in the previous parliamentary election. But beyond that, you know, however much Parliament offers a platform for the opposition, ultimately this is, as Emma noted in her opening remarks, a new system, a presidential system, which concentrates power in the hands of a single man. So what happens with the presidency is really key here.
I fully agree with that. I want to say that after what you just explained, the fact that there is such a strong opposition that remains in Turkey, I think is a very, very positive takeaway from my perspective.
Can I add something? The HDP closure case. I think there's the case is going to be a slow process because this way, in the run-up to elections, whenever they're held, Erdoğan wants this to be the only thing that's being debated, to divert attention away from economic problems, from systemic corruption. So he wants this fight to be over identity, not over real problems that everyday people face. And second, I think by closing down the party, he's hoping to shrink the HDP base. Obviously, you can close down the party, but you cannot make 6 million people who voted for the party disappear. But some of those voters might not turn out to vote, thinking that, I mean, what's the point? If he can disenfranchise 6 million people, why bother to vote? But more importantly, I think by closing down the party, Erdoğan will have more space to manipulate election results in the Kurdish regions. Without HDP election observers, without them mobilizing the voters to go to the ballot box, Erdoğan will have more opportunities to engage in election fraud.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
May I just very quickly add something, though? Beyond all the electoral sort of arithmetic here, I think the broader aim of this government, this regime, and its informal coalition ally, and whoever else supports them in the security apparatus, the army and elsewhere, is basically to smash the Kurdish, the Abdullah Öcalan-led Kurdish movement. They wouldn't call it nationalist, I do, in Turkey, in all its iterations, be it through its civil society arms, women's organizations, the HDP, everything. They want to smash it, and they want to redesign in their minds. They think they can achieve this. The Kurds, really, that's what they're looking to do.
So you think that the long-term game is to actually annihilate Kurdish
Oh,
nationalism?
absolutely. I don't know what Emma thinks, but I certainly think that.
Well, Emma, I do want to ask your opinion on that. And we had a very good question that came from the audience, which is about the Constitutional Court, which relates to what we're discussing now. Because occasionally we do see the Constitutional Court make some decisions that are not in Erdogan's favor or thinking, such as they just recently returned the case to closed HDP out of a technicality. I think it's going to come back to, as all of you mentioned. But occasionally we see things, some people, the Constitutional Court will say, they should be released, and they will be released, high-profile political detainees. So could we call, the question is, but in many ways, Erdogan has also made many appointments to this Constitutional Court, and some people say that it's totally taken over by Erdogan. Some people see it as still the last bastion. How do you see the Constitutional Court right now and the role it's playing? Is it really more of is it still acting independently, do you think, of the executive? Or when it does, why does it?
I think with each new appointment to the Constitutional Court, the executive control is consolidated. And the executive control isn't just one thing. It's not just Erdogan. It's Erdogan's coalition partner as well. So, for example, Irfan Fidan is now Constitutional Court. That's a completely loyalist former chief prosecutor who's going to play a role in the Constitutional Court now and will determine, has been responsible for some very, very negative developments in Istanbul in his term there. So I think, there's no relying on the Constitutional Court. The head of the Constitutional Court has been on the side of good decisions, Utu Arslan, very clearly so. But the balance of the numbers in the Constitutional Court is now going in another direction, which means it will be very difficult to get good decisions out of the Constitutional Court. At the moment, you get 1 or 2 good decisions every so often on cases that are not in the public eye, are not political, well, they're political, but not well-known cases. But when you get cases like, for example, the case of Osman Kavala. The Constitutional Court has found no violation of Osman Kavala's rights, despite the European Court saying there was. And so, you know, that's pretty much shows you that there's not a lot to be expected from the Constitutional Court. I think it's a very difficult position it's in, those who are trying to rule independently. Now, I think the rejection of the HDP, the indictment against HDP, is interesting because it's quite a profound rejection. It profoundly says that this doesn't meet the bar. You cannot, there's no evidence here that could link, you know, could support a closure case. That's exactly what they're saying. And that's pretty fundamental. How are they going to correct that? It's not a question of just deleting a couple of names and changing spelling mistakes. There's got to be a bit more put into that. It might be that the reckoning is that this is too early, if you know, to have a closure case. That if you rush ahead with the Kobani trial that's going to start on Monday, then you'll go further down the road towards supporting a closure case. But it's extremely weak, as all closure cases have been. It's good that they've rejected it, of course. It may come back, but you know, I think the broader question here is you may not need to close the party down. It may be that you can take a lot of time stripping people of their seats by removing their immunity, and it can, as Gönül said, you know, fill the political agenda. The discussion of the HDP can go on and on and on for months, and it will be an attempt to divert attention from other issues. Yes, an intent to kind of end the Kurdish political movement, as Amberin has said. I agree with that. That may be the intent. But it's extremely time consuming, all of this. And it does actually really, you know, you could strip the financing, you can change the political parties law, you can change the election law. There are all sorts of other things you can do against the HDP to make it more and more dysfunctional. And just having so many party officials in prison or under prosecution at any time, you know, millions, hundreds of thousands of people in Turkey are under judicial control, have travel bans, if not in prison. And that is also a way to disable people's political activity, and they cannot be very effective functionaries if they've got all these cases they're facing. So you're also stemming the flow of a sort of younger generation entering politics too by going after them continually. But one thing I would love to mention just here quickly is that I think follow the money is one of the big issues we should be focusing on, and it's come up now with corruption. And it is interesting, I think, that minister was removed because of her links, the company that she had links with, and that Erdogan felt the need to remove her. That is interesting. And it is interesting, the response to this 126 billion, where is 126 billion dollars thing. I mean, it is going on, it's rumbling on, all the parties are speaking on it. It's bound to come up again with Kanal Istanbul project. And I think in a way this does take us into a direction that, you know, if the opposition could keep on that track, and people have no money in their pockets and they're seeing massive corruption, I think that could be effective, obviously. And I mean, we don't, as Human Rights Watch, we don't work much on corruption. Corruption is a difficult issue to pin down. Organizations like Transparency International look at these things, but it's not easy.
But I do agree that corruption will likely seem to be another big thing moving forward. I do have to end our panel now, but I do want to give you all just one sentence final thoughts if you do have them. If it's any pressing, no, I can see from your face if it isn't. So then thank you all for joining. I know we could talk another few hours on all of these topics, but I think this was an incredibly informative panel. Thank you for all of your insightful comments, and thank you to our audience for listening to us. Hopefully you've learned a lot. I did. Thanks again, and we will be in touch with follow-up questions, I'm sure, moving forward. Thank you.